I'm Sarah Mitchell, and for 28 years I lived inside a story I didn't realize I'd agreed to. I can't pinpoint exactly when I started believing my purpose was to be the perfect daughter. Maybe it was during those evenings when my mom helped me with my homework, or those times my dad clapped the loudest at my piano recitals. They always told me how proud they were of me. And for me, those words were like oxygen. I needed them to breathe, to live, to feel like I mattered. I grew up in a small house in suburban Connecticut. We had the classic white picket fence, blooming flowers every spring, and family photos covering the walls. From the outside, we looked like the perfect American family, the kind you see in those heartwarming holiday commercials. And I, Sarah Mitchell, was their only daughter, their pride, their shining star that they showed off to neighbors and friends. I didn't realize when I silently agreed to push aside my own desires just to keep their smiles in place. Maybe it started when I quit the basketball team because Dad didn't like the idea of his daughter playing sports. Maybe it was when I gave up my favorite art class to take extra science courses because Mom once said nursing is a noble profession. The truth is I didn't hate studying medicine. I love children. I love taking care of people. But it was never my dream. My dream had always been colors and canvases, the quiet magic of paintbrushes in the dead of night creating something that was entirely mine. It was the only time I allowed myself to touch that part of me those few hours after midnight when my parents were asleep. But I chose nursing. Because one evening, Mom brushed my hand gently and said, "You would make a wonderful nurse, Sarah. It's a stable, noble career. We would be so proud of you." I lived for that sentence. I let it steer every major decision I made. I turned down a full scholarship to the Rhode Island School of Design, a scholarship my high school art teacher, Mrs. Winters, said was so rare she'd only recommended 3 students for it in her entire 27-year career. I remember holding that acceptance letter in my shaking hands, tracing the embossed logo, daring to imagine a life where I could create freely, where I could be seen for my art. But I folded the letter, slipped it between the pages of my diary, and never spoke of it again. I chose nursing. I chose to stay. Even when my classmates spread their wings and left for big cities, even when Boston Children's Hospital offered me a coveted position after graduation, I stayed. Dad had said, "The house will feel so empty without you." That one sentence so simple was enough to anchor me. I became a pediatric nurse at the local hospital. I built a career I could be proud of, but I never felt whole. I lived in the same house I grew up in the same bedroom where my parents hung photos of me in graduation robes, surrounded by the medals and certificates I'd collected over the years. On the outside, I was the perfect daughter, always punctual for work handling Dad's tax paperwork, driving Mom to her doctor's appointments, spending weekends in the garden, helping Dad with yard work. I never said no to them. I never put myself first. I thought if I just loved them enough, if I sacrificed enough, they would never see me as a burden. Tara, my best friend, once asked me over coffee, "Sarah, who are you really living for? You're 28, still living at home, still working a job you don't really love. When are you going to start living for yourself?" I stirred my latte, watching the milk spiral into the coffee, whispering, "They've given me everything. Is it really so wrong to want to be there for them?" Tara looked at me, her eyes heavy with sadness and frustration. There's a difference between being there for someone and losing yourself for them. And Sarah, you're losing yourself. I smiled softly and changed the subject. I didn't want to hear it. I wasn't ready to face it. I thought I knew who I was. I thought I was living the right life. But the truth is I was trapped in a beautiful cage that I built for myself. I lived that way for 28 years. I lived as though my existence only had value if it made them happy. I lived without ever daring to ask, what about me? Sometimes the most painful truths don't come from strangers. They come from the people you've spent your whole life loving. It was supposed to be a perfect day. I'd spent weeks, maybe months, orchestrating every detail. I had planned my parents' 30th wedding anniversary like my life depended on it, because in a way I thought it did. I wanted to give them something unforgettable, something that would finally make them see how much I had given up for them, how deeply I love them. For 3 years, I'd been saving in secret, picking up extra shifts, skipping vacations, cutting back on things for myself to buy them the one gift I knew they'd always dreamed of: a family trip to Italy. 3 tickets, me, Mom and Dad. I even convinced my brother Michael to join us. I imagined the moment when I would hand them the envelope with the tickets, the surprise, the gratitude, the joy lighting up their faces. I thought, maybe this will finally be enough. I couldn't have known how wrong I was. The morning of the party, I was up at sunrise adjusting flowers, double-checking the seating, perfecting everything down to the last napkin. I wanted it to be flawless. I wanted to prove, even if only to myself, that I was worthy. The weather was perfect golden summer sunlight filtering through the maple trees in our backyard, laughter echoing as friends arrived carrying silver-wrapped gifts. My mom looked radiant in her blue dress, her silver-streaked hair pinned back elegantly. Dad, always proud of his role as host, welcomed guests with his firm handshakes and warm smiles. I floated between tables, refilling drinks, greeting neighbors, making sure everyone was comfortable. I thought I was creating something beautiful, a memory we would all cherish. When it was time for my toast, I clinked my glass and said, "To 30 years of love. May we all be fortunate enough to build what you have." I meant every word. They smiled, they kissed, the crowd applauded, and for that brief moment I believed we were everything I had spent my life pretending we were. After dinner, I went to the kitchen to prepare the anniversary cake. Through the window, I saw my parents sitting in the gazebo surrounded by their closest friends, the Harrisons and the Bakers, whiskey glasses in hand, the kind Dad only brought out for special occasions. I was about to turn away when I heard my name. "Sarah is a wonderful daughter," Mrs. Harrison was saying. "You two are so lucky she stayed close. Our kids moved across the country the moment they graduated." There was a pause, and then my father's voice, softened by whiskey, and nostalgia answered in a tone I had never heard before. "Sometimes I wonder about that. Having Sarah, it changed everything. If I'm honest, if we hadn't had her when we did, our lives would have gone in a very different direction." I froze, the cake box suddenly heavy in my hands. "And remember when I got that offer in California?" Dad continued. "We would have gone. Linda could have finished her PhD. I waited, desperate for my mother to protest, to say something, anything. But instead I heard her sigh, a soft, wistful sound that broke me. "We were packed and ready to go when I found out I was pregnant," she said. "Sometimes I wonder what our lives would have been like. I hate to admit it, but there are days I regret it too." The cake box slipped from my hands, crashing to the floor, frosting and porcelain splintering around me. But I barely noticed. My ears were ringing, my breath caught in my throat. Mr. Baker's uncomfortable laugh cut through the silence. "Oh, come on, you don't mean that." "Of course we love her," Dad quickly added. "But you can love someone and still recognize they changed your path. We had such different plans before Sarah came along." Mom's voice followed, softer but no less cutting. "We were so young, 24. We had the world in front of us. Suddenly we were tied to a mortgage and a life we didn't plan." I stood there numb as more pieces of my life shattered around me. I realized I had never been the beautiful blessing I imagined. I had been the turning point they never asked for. The terrible irony crashed over me. I had stayed for them. I had built my life around being near them because I thought that's what they wanted. And now I understood they let me stay because they felt too guilty to ask me to leave. Every sacrifice I'd made, every dream I'd buried, every opportunity I'd passed up, it had all been for parents who saw me as the living embodiment of the life they could have had. I barely made it to the bathroom before the sobs overtook me. I clutched the edge of the sink, mascara streaking down my face, my chest heaving with betrayal. Every memory, every subtle look, every half-hearted nod came flooding back with painful clarity. The time Dad's expression faltered when I declined the Boston job to stay local. The tightness in Mom's smile when I told her I'd given up the art scholarship. The way they always encouraged Michael to chase his dreams while quietly keeping me close. I had spent 28 years interpreting their behavior as appreciation. But maybe all along it had been resignation. Maybe I was never what they wanted. Maybe I was just what they settled for. When I finally returned to the party, my face washed and my smile carefully reassembled, I moved like a ghost. I served the salvaged cake. I accepted compliments on the party planning. I laughed at the right moments. I stood beside them as they posed for photographs, feeling like I was fading out of my own life. As the last guest left, Mom hugged me tightly and whispered, "Everything was beautiful, Sarah. Thank you for all your hard work." I hugged her back stiff and hollow. "You deserve it," I said, the words catching in my throat. But I realized then I had given them everything. And I was the only one who didn't know I had been the thing they never really wanted. That night, I sat at my desk and wrote in my diary until the sun rose. I poured out the raw, ugly truth. The family I thought I had, the role I thought I played, it wasn't real. And for the first time, I asked myself the question I had been too afraid to face. Who am I if I stop living for them? Sometimes the hardest part isn't hearing the truth. It's realizing you've spent your whole life building yourself around a lie. The days after the anniversary party were a blur. I moved through my life on autopilot, clinging to the familiar routines that used to anchor me. I woke up at the same time. I made my dad his coffee just the way he liked it, black 2 sugars. I helped my mom sort through the mail in the afternoons. We ate dinner together at the same old kitchen table, talked about weather ghee. But inside I was disintegrating. The words I overheard that night replayed in my mind on an endless loop. I had built my entire life around making them proud, staying close, sacrificing my dreams, and now I couldn't unhear the fact that I had been their regret. Not a disappointment, not an accident, a regret. Something they would have chosen differently if given the chance. I searched their faces in those quiet moments at breakfast, while we watched TV, while I helped Mom in the garden, hoping I had misunderstood, hoping I had heard them wrong, hoping they would somehow say something, anything that would erase what I'd heard. But all I found were little confirmations I had never noticed before. On Tuesday morning, my dad flipped through a travel magazine while eating his oatmeal. He paused at a photo of Bali crystal waters, white sand beaches. "Jim Harrison is retiring early next year," Dad said, not looking up. "He and Carol are spending 6 months traveling Southeast Asia. Must be nice to have that kind of freedom at their age." I stared into my bowl, listening for the unspoken words. Freedom they would have had without me. That evening, Mom was on the phone with an old college friend. After she hung up, she sighed, her eyes distant. She just got promoted to university dean. We were both accepted into the same doctoral program, you know. Life takes us in different directions, doesn't it? She smiled at me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "But we all make our choices." It was a quiet sentence, innocent on the surface, but it landed like a stone in my chest. By Thursday, I couldn't bear it anymore. I found myself sitting in my car during my lunch break at the hospital, clutching my phone like it was the last rope holding me to the life I'd always known. And then, without fully realizing what I was doing, I called a real estate agent. I needed out. That evening, Diane the agent showed me a tiny 1-bedroom apartment across town. It wasn't anything special. Cream-colored walls, old appliances, windows that overlooked a cracked courtyard. But standing there in the middle of that empty space, something inside me cracked open. It was the smallest fissure of possibility. "I'll take it," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I signed the lease that night. It was the first decision I'd made in years that had nothing to do with my parents. I didn't tell anyone, not even Tara. I needed this to be mine. The days that followed were filled with quiet, careful preparation. I packed my belongings piece by piece, making sure to only take the things they wouldn't notice right away. Old photo albums, a few cherished books, my small stack of watercolor paintings. These went first, hidden in my nursing tote, as I slipped out the door each morning. At the hospital between patient rounds, I scrolled through listings of art classes at the nearby community center. I found myself filling out an application for a part-time docent position at the Connecticut Museum of Art, something I never would have dared to pursue before. In those secret moments, I began to wonder, who might I have become if I had chosen differently? And even more frightening, who might I still become? My diary became my refuge. Every night I poured out the storm of emotions I had been holding for years. I wrote about the weight of being the good daughter, about the cost of all the dreams I had folded away for the sake of being needed. I wrote about the love I still felt for my parents and the unbearable distance their words had created. One Sunday night, as I helped my dad organize some paperwork, he leaned back in his chair and stared at an old photo of him and Mom backpacking through Yellowstone in their 20s. "Life is strange, Sarah," he said, his voice distant. "You start out thinking you'll do all these grand things, go all these places, and then reality sets in." He looked at me not with anger but with resignation. The responsible path isn't always the exciting one, but sometimes that's just what life is. I knew in that moment that he wasn't just talking about himself. He was handing me the same story. He was preparing me to accept the quiet life, the small life, the safe life. But I wasn't ready to inherit his resignation. The next morning, I overheard them talking about the Nelson's family friends, who had recently become empty nesters. "They've sold their house and bought a condo in Florida," Mom said. "Janice says they feel 10 years younger now that they have the place to themselves." Dad chuckled. "Something to look forward to, I suppose." Mom's soft laugh followed. "One day, the house will be quiet. We can turn Sarah's room into that art studio you've always wanted." I pressed my hand against my mouth to keep from crying out. They weren't waiting for me to find my wings. They were waiting for me to finally leave so they could build the life they still dreamed about. That night, I made my final decision. While they were out playing bridge with friends, I went up to the attic and sorted through the boxes of my childhood. The report cards, the glittery Mother's Day cards, the participation trophies from soccer. I only played because Dad was the coach. Buried at the bottom was the letter from the Rhode Island School of Design, still pressed between the pages of my high school art portfolio. I clutched it to my chest and wept, not just for the life I had lost, but for the version of me I had abandoned. As dawn broke, I packed my remaining belongings into 2 suitcases. I left my diary on the center of my neatly made bed, along with the envelope holding the Italy tickets I would never give them. There would be no dramatic exit, no screaming matches, no final pleas. Just me, quietly choosing myself for the first time. As I pulled out of the driveway, watching the only home I'd ever known disappear in the rearview mirror, I felt something else rise beneath the heartbreak. A tiny trembling flicker of freedom. For the first time, I was walking away not from them, but toward myself. The morning I left didn't feel dramatic. It didn't look like the movies where someone storms out in tears, slams doors, or shouts final words. No, my leaving was quiet, deliberate. I folded the last sweater into my suitcase. I took one last glance at the bedroom where I had built a life for everyone else. And I left my diary on the neatly made bed, sitting right next to the envelope holding the Italy tickets I'd spent 3 years saving for. The house was silent as I slipped out the door, my footsteps careful on the gravel driveway. My parents wouldn't wake for another hour. When they did, they would find the space I left behind. I hoped maybe they would finally see me for the first time. As I drove away, I expected to feel consumed by guilt, by sadness, by panic. Instead, what I felt was space. There was suddenly room to breathe, room to think, room to exist beyond the invisible weight I'd been carrying for nearly 3 decades. The apartment I'd rented wasn't much, just a small 1-bedroom in a worn Victorian house across town. Cream-colored walls, scuffed floors, an outdated kitchen with a sink that dripped. But to me, it was everything. It was mine. The first place I had chosen for myself. The first night I sat on the floor of my empty apartment eating cold Chinese takeout straight from the box. My phone buzzed over and over, calls from Mom, Dad, and again Mom, voicemails piling up, texts flashing on the screen. "Sarah, where are you? Please call us. We're worried sick. Come home, we can talk about this. Why would you do this? What's going on?" They had found the diary. They knew why I left. But in their voices, I heard something else. They weren't just confused, they were shocked. It had never occurred to them that I would ever step outside the role I had spent my life playing. I turned off my phone that night. The next morning, I sent them a single text before heading to my shift at the children's hospital. "I'm safe. I need space. Please respect that." When I finished my 12-hour shift, there were 17 missed calls waiting for me. One voicemail from my dad, his tone somewhere between anger and disbelief. "Sarah Jean Mitchell, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but your mother is beside herself. Whatever you think you heard, you misunderstood. Come home tonight so we can sort this nonsense out." The authority in his voice that used to make me shrink, to make me comply, no longer had power over me. I deleted the message. Instead, I drove straight to the community center where I had quietly signed up for a watercolor class. 2 hours of painting of letting color bleed across wet paper felt like stepping into a version of myself I hadn't visited in years. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't doing something to make anyone else proud. I was doing it just for me. Gabriella, the instructor, paused behind my chair as I carefully layered soft blues and deep purples across the page. "You've done this before," she said, studying my brushstrokes. "There's muscle memory in those hands." I looked up at her, blinking away the tears. "A lifetime ago." She smiled softly and squeezed my shoulder. "Welcome back, then." Those 3 words followed me home that night like a quiet blessing. Days passed in a strange new rhythm. Work, art class, simple dinners in my tiny kitchen, short conversations with the neighbors I was just beginning to know. The silence in my apartment was no longer heavy. It became comforting, like a blank canvas, waiting for me to decide what I wanted to put on it. My parents' messages slowly shifted from panic to guilt. "Your dad's blood pressure isn't great. The doctor is worried. The house feels so empty without you. We've always been a close family. What will people think?" I responded only to let them know I was safe. But I didn't engage. I wasn't ready to step back into their orbit, not until I was sure I could hold on to this fragile new self I was discovering. One evening, as I struggled to carry groceries up the stairs, my across-the-hall neighbor Dorothy appeared like she'd been waiting for me. "Been watching you coming and going," she said, grabbing a bag from my overloaded arms. "Young woman all alone working hospital shifts. Reminds me of myself at your age." There was something in her eyes, steady, kind, and free of judgment, that made me sit down and tell her everything. I didn't mean to. The words just spilled out. When I finished, she nodded thoughtfully and said, "Families are complicated ecosystems, Sarah. Sometimes a plant needs different soil to truly flourish, even if there's love in the original garden." Her words settled deep inside me, easing knots I hadn't known how to untangle. We started having tea together in the evenings, sharing stories about our lives, about the weight of expectations, about how hard it is to claim your own life when you've been conditioned to live for others. Dorothy became the first person who didn't try to pull me back to who I was. She simply welcomed who I was becoming. Weeks later, an unexpected email arrived from Boston Children's Hospital. They were offering me a unique position, a blend of pediatric nursing and art therapy for long-term patients. It was the kind of role that aligned with both my medical training and the creative life I thought I'd lost. Moving to Boston, a month ago that would have felt impossible. But now the idea felt like breathing. I sat with the offer for several days, discussing it with Dorothy, weighing the fear and the excitement in equal measure. Eventually, I accepted the interview. I was stepping into a life I had never thought could belong to me. Around the same time, Michael called from Germany. "They're completely blindsided, Sarah," he said. "Dad thinks you're having some kind of breakdown." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Of course that's what he thinks. God forbid they consider I might be having a breakthrough instead." There was a long pause. "You know, I always felt guilty for leaving. Like I abandoned you, like I left you to carry all of it on your own." "You weren't abandoning me," I said softly. "You were just living your life. I was really good at not living mine." Michael's voice was steady when he said, "When you figure out who Sarah really is, I'd like to meet her." In my little apartment surrounded by watercolors and secondhand furniture, I began to build something new. Not a life built for anyone else. Not a life crafted around guilt or expectation. For the first time, I was living for me. And for the first time, I was finally becoming someone I wanted to know. There's a moment when you stop fearing the confrontation because what's worse is never being heard at all. It had been exactly 1 week since I left when the knock came. I was sitting at my small kitchen table sketching the view from my window while sipping coffee. The morning sunlight poured in soft and quiet, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was starting to belong in my own life. Then I heard it. 3 sharp knocks, 2 softer ones, the rhythm. The same rhythm Dad always used when he knocked on my bedroom door. My heart thudded hard in my chest as I walked to the peephole. There they were, Mom and Dad, standing awkwardly in the hallway outside my apartment. Mom's hands clutched her purse like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Dad's face was set in that familiar, stern expression, but something about him looked smaller now, less certain, older. For a second, I thought about pretending I wasn't home. I thought about waiting until they left, putting this off, making myself feel ready. But Dorothy's words from the night before echoed in my mind. Avoidance doesn't make the storm go away. It just gives it time to grow. So I opened the door. We stood there frozen, caught in the impossible distance between who we had been and who we were now. Mom's eyes brimmed with tears. "Sarah," she whispered, and even in just those 2 syllables I heard her heart break. Finally, I stepped aside and silently let them in. They entered cautiously, their eyes moving over the small apartment, the simple furniture, the watercolor paintings already hanging on the walls. Mom paused in front of the largest one, a sunset over water in bold orange and purple hues. "You're painting again," she said softly, almost like it was a discovery. "I don't think I've seen your work since high school." Her voice lingered in the air, heavy with all the years she had missed, all the parts of me I had hidden. Dad stood rigid by the door, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "We read your diary," he said quickly, his tone more defensive than apologetic. "You had no right to just disappear like that. We've been worried sick." It was the same pattern I'd known all my life. He started with an accusation, a demand, a way to control the conversation. In the past, I would have rushed to apologize, to soothe the tension, to fix everything. But I wasn't the same Sarah anymore. I gestured toward the couch. "Why don't we sit down?" We arranged ourselves awkwardly in the small living room, my parents on the couch, me in the single chair across from them. The coffee table between us felt like a chasm, a barrier that neither of us knew how to cross. The silence stretched until Mom broke it first. "We're trying to understand what you wrote," she said, her voice trembling. "You made it sound like we've been terrible parents, like we don't love you. How could you think that?" Her confusion was real. And for the first time, I realized what that meant. They truly didn't understand the weight of what they had said. They didn't realize how deeply their words had unraveled me. "I heard you," I said quietly. "At the anniversary party, in the gazebo. You said you regretted having me." Their faces shifted, first shock, then shame, then that familiar urge to explain. Dad jumped in first. "Sarah, you completely misunderstood the context. We were just reminiscing about life's crossroads. Everyone wonders about roads not taken. That doesn't mean you said it." I interrupted, my voice steady despite the pain tightening in my throat. "Those were your exact words. Mom said, 'There are days I regret it too.' I spent my whole life trying to be worthy of you, trying to compensate for whatever I had taken from you by simply existing." Mom's tears finally spilled over. "It wasn't about you, Sarah. Not really. We were talking about timing, about being young and unprepared. Of course we don't regret you. Then why did I grow up feeling like I had to earn my place in this family?" I asked the question, falling from some hidden, buried part of me. Why did I spend 28 years trying not to be a burden? Why did I give up everything I wanted to make you happy? Dad rubbed his temples, his voice lower, more vulnerable than I'd ever heard. "We never asked you to give anything up. The nursing career, staying in Connecticut, that was your choice. Was it?" I pushed back gently but firmly. "When I got the art scholarship, you made it clear you didn't think art was a real career. When I was offered the Boston job, you talked about how empty the house would feel without me. You never had to ask me outright. I knew what was expected. The silence between us was thick and raw. For once, my dad didn't rush to fill it. Finally, he said, when I told my father I wanted to go into accounting instead of law school, he said I was throwing my life away. He called it settling for mediocrity. I swore I'd never pressure my own kids like that." His voice cracked a little. "I didn't realize I was doing the same thing to you, just in a different way." Mom wiped at her face with trembling hands. "My parents were always so cold. They only cared about grades and achievements. I wanted so badly to build a stable family. I wanted to be different. I wanted to make you feel safe. I thought we were being supportive. I thought we were showing you how proud we were." I looked at them, really looked at them, and for the first time they didn't seem like the all-knowing figures who had shaped every corner of my life. They looked like two people carrying wounds of their own. Two people who had done their best with what they knew, people who still made mistakes. "I'm not leaving to punish you," I said. "I'm leaving because I need to find out who I am outside of being your daughter. I need to know who I am when I stop trying to earn your pride." Dad opened his mouth to protest, but Mom gently placed her hand on his arm. She understood at least enough to let me finish. "For the first time, I'm making choices that aren't about you. They're about me, and I need space to do that. I'm not cutting you out of my life, but our relationship needs to change." When they left 2 hours later, nothing was fully resolved. There were no neat conclusions, no grand reconciliations, but something had shifted. We had finally started seeing each other clearly, not as roles, but as people. As I watched them walk to their car from my apartment window, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Because I had finally spoken the truth I had swallowed for years. And maybe they had finally heard me. Some relationships don't break, they unravel. And sometimes with patience, they can be woven back together, not the same, but maybe stronger. 6 months had passed since I walked away from my childhood home. 6 months of learning what it meant to stand on my own. 6 months of learning how to live without performing, without chasing approval, without filling a role that had quietly suffocated me for years. I still remember standing at the window of my Boston apartment that first winter, watching the early December snow coat the city streets. The view felt foreign and exciting, the historic brownstones, the rush of people who didn't know me, the distant shimmer of the Charles River. It was nothing like the small-town streets I had known my whole life. My apartment slowly became a reflection of the person I was becoming, not the daughter I had carefully curated for nearly 3 decades. The walls, once bare, now displayed my watercolors and charcoal sketches pieces I had painted simply because they made me feel alive. Medical textbooks shared space with art history volumes and novels I'd never let myself explore before. It wasn't perfect. I wasn't perfect. The first few weeks at Boston Children's Hospital were overwhelming. The new role combining pediatric nursing with art therapy for long-term patients pushed me beyond anything I thought I could handle. I cried in bathroom stalls between sessions, questioning whether I had made the biggest mistake of my life. Who was I to think I could start over? Who was I to think I could build something new? But slowly things shifted. I saw how my young patients responded to the freedom of art, their joy when they mixed colors, the pride when they created something entirely their own. I began to trust my instincts again, not just as a nurse, but as a person. My colleagues sought my input. My supervisors encouraged me. And little by little, a new kind of confidence bloomed in me, one not built on pleasing others, but on genuinely belonging to myself. The transformation inside me was harder to manage. The first Thanksgiving away from home was brutal. I sat at a hospital potluck surrounded by friendly colleagues, but I couldn't shake the ache of not being in my parents' kitchen, not hearing the familiar clatter of plates, not sitting in my usual seat at the table. That night, I called my parents. The conversation was careful and awkward, like we were navigating a new language none of us had fully learned. Still, it was a start. Over time, our contact settled into a steady rhythm, weekly phone calls that were quieter, more thoughtful. My mom started sending me little packages, honey, from the local farmers market newspaper clippings about Boston art exhibits, sometimes even art supplies. One day, a small box arrived with a set of professional watercolors and a simple note. "These made me think of you." My dad's way of reconnecting was different. Short, sometimes clumsy text messages about the weather. Red Sox scores, updates on the neighborhood. He never pushed me about when I'd come home. He didn't ask me to return. And for the first time, I felt like they were starting to respect the space I needed. In early October, an email arrived from my brother Michael. His engineering firm had assigned him to a temporary project in Boston, and he wanted to meet for coffee face-to-face for the first time in years. When we met in a small cafe near Fenway Park, there was a strange tension between us. I think we were both unsure of how to relate outside the roles we'd played in our family for so long. But once we started talking, the conversation flowed easier than I expected. "I always envied you, you know," he said halfway through his second espresso. "You were the golden child, the one who stayed, the one who always knew how to make them happy." I nearly laughed into my tea. "And I always envied you for your freedom, for your ability to just leave." We sat in silence for a moment, both of us realizing how wrong we'd been about each other. That coffee turned into a weekly ritual during his 3-month stay. Over time, we peeled back layers of childhood memories, sharing perspectives we had never dared to voice before. One day, Michael told me something I hadn't expected. "They're in therapy," he said. "Both of them. Dad called me, actually asked if I felt the same way you did growing up." I was so shocked I almost dropped my phone. I could barely picture it, my stoic father willingly sitting in a therapist's office revisiting the past, questioning his parenting. But hearing that made something loosen inside me, like I wasn't the only one doing the work to heal. I started therapy too. Dr. Levine, with her calm presence and piercing questions, helped me unravel the years of guilt, the weight of unspoken expectations, and the blurry boundaries I had never known how to set. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or excusing," she told me during one session. "It means releasing the expectation that the past could have been different." That stayed with me. In November, we started planning my first visit back home for Christmas. But this time I set boundaries. I would stay for 3 days, not a week. I would sleep in a hotel, not my old bedroom. And we would focus on creating new memories, not dragging each other back into old wounds. It felt terrifying and necessary. In early December, I had my first art exhibition. My watercolor series Metamorphosis was displayed alongside other emerging Boston artists. I stood there nervously surrounded by strangers, asking about my process, my inspirations, my journey. Then I saw her, Dorothy, my neighbor from the apartment I'd left behind. She had made the trip from Connecticut despite the winter storm. "Couldn't miss your debut," she said, wrapping me in a warm hug. "These paintings, they breathe. They have life." Before she left, she pressed a small tissue-wrapped package into my hand. "Open it later." That night, I unwrapped the gift, a leather-bound journal, the first page inscribed with a quote from Mary Oliver. "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" I sat down at my desk, opened to the second page, and began writing not another diary entry, but a letter to the version of myself I had abandoned. "You are enough. You don't have to earn love. You are allowed to take up space." The journey wasn't finished. Maybe it never would be. But as I looked around my apartment filled with my art, my choices, my life, I felt something I had never truly felt before: peace, and the quiet, steady joy of finally coming home to myself. I used to think my story ended when I walked away, but healing isn't a finish line. It's a life you build one choice at a time. The snow was falling again, as I sat by the window of my Boston apartment sketching quietly, watching the soft white blanket cover the streets below. 6 months had passed since I'd left home, and while I had imagined that this much time would bring clarity, the truth was healing wasn't a straight road. It was a winding, messy journey, and some days I still felt like I was just learning how to walk. I thought that leaving would bring me immediate freedom. I thought distance would sever the old pain like cutting a string. But what I've learned is this distance doesn't erase your past. It gives you the space to face it with fresh eyes. My relationship with my parents didn't magically heal after that conversation in my apartment. It didn't click back into place like a puzzle piece I had just forgotten to set right. But slowly, something began to shift. Not because I went back to being the daughter they wanted, but because I finally stood firm in being the person I was becoming. Our weekly phone calls became more comfortable over time. Less like a performance and more like a conversation. I noticed that my dad stopped asking when I would come home. My mom no longer guilted me about the empty seat at the table. Instead, they asked about my work, about the art I was creating, about the life I was living. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And that was more than I ever thought I'd have. In December, I returned home for Christmas for the first time since I left. But this time I came back on my own terms. I stayed in a hotel, not in my old bedroom. I stayed for 3 days, not for a full week. And most importantly, I didn't go back to being the Sarah I used to be. Walking into the house felt surreal. Everything looked the same. The carefully arranged family photos, the faint smell of my mother's apple pie, the Christmas tree we'd always decorated together. But I was different, and they could feel it. There were awkward silences, moments when we stumbled into old patterns, but this time I didn't shrink to fit the mold. When Mom asked if I wanted to help prepare dinner, I said yes, not because I felt obligated, but because I chose to. When Dad commented, "It's nice having the family back together." I smiled and said, "It's nice to visit." I didn't let the weight of expectation creep back in. They didn't push. There was something in their eyes, a kind of caution, like they were learning the new rules of our relationship too. On Christmas Eve after dinner, my mom quietly handed me a small wrapped package. Inside was a leather-bound sketchbook with my initials embossed on the cover. "I thought maybe you'd like to start fresh," she said softly. For a second, I didn't know what to say. I looked at her, at the woman I had spent so long trying to please, and I realized something had changed. Not everything, but something. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. Before I left to return to Boston, we hugged, not the tight, clinging hugs of the past, but something lighter, something that acknowledged both the distance and the connection. In the months that followed, I settled into the life I was building for myself. My work at the hospital became more fulfilling as I grew into my unique role blending pediatric care with art therapy. I wasn't just showing up to check boxes or meet expectations. I was making a difference in a way that finally felt true to me. I started participating in more local art exhibitions, slowly building confidence in my creative voice. My paintings were no longer hidden away in a corner of my bedroom. They were displayed, seen, and celebrated. My friendship with Dorothy remained a grounding force. We spoke often, her voice on the phone, still carrying the warmth of our tea-filled evenings back in Connecticut. She reminded me regularly that growth wasn't linear, that some days would still feel like a return to old wounds. "Just don't unpack and live there," she would say. "You've built too much to go back now." One rainy evening in the spring, I was preparing for an upcoming art show when I received a call from my dad. His voice was soft, hesitant. "I was wondering, would you send me a picture of your latest painting? Your mother and I would love to see what you're working on." It was the first time he had asked about my art without sounding dismissive, without trying to steer the conversation back to safer topics. I could hear the effort in his words, the conscious attempt to reach me where I had always been, instead of where he wanted me to stay. I sent him a photo that night. His reply was simple: "It's beautiful. We're proud of you." And for the first time, I believed it. Not because I had stayed, not because I had lived the life they expected, but because I had finally stepped into the life that was mine. Michael and I kept in touch regularly, our bond stronger, now that we had peeled back the misconceptions of our childhood. When his project in Boston ended, we promised to keep our conversations going, not as distant siblings trapped in roles, but as real people learning how to know each other all over again. The journey isn't over. I still have hard days. I still catch myself seeking approval. I still feel the ache of old habits trying to pull me back. But now I can see them, I can name them, and I can choose differently. The journal Dorothy gave me sits on my desk, filling slowly with new chapters, not of someone chasing worth, but of someone living it. I've come to understand that some beginnings are disguised as endings. Leaving wasn't the conclusion of my story, it was the first step in writing it for myself. And maybe that's what healing really is: not forgetting the past, not erasing the pain, but standing in the middle of it all and saying, "I choose me." If you've ever stood in that place, if you've ever questioned where your story begins, I hope you know you can choose you too. Thank you for witnessing my journey. I've told you my story, the parts I once kept hidden, the painful realizations, the moments I thought would break me. And now, as I sit here with my journal open staring at a blank page, I realize this story isn't just mine. It belongs to anyone who's ever questioned their worth inside their own family. To anyone who's ever mistaken quiet resignation for unconditional love. To anyone who's ever asked themselves, who am I if I stop living for them? For years, I didn't ask that question. I didn't know I was allowed to. I thought being a good daughter meant staying sacrificing, fitting into the small, careful spaces others made for me. I thought love was something you earned by giving more, by needing less. It took me 28 years to realize I had built my entire identity around the pursuit of approval that was never truly required, or maybe never truly mine to receive in the way I needed. Leaving wasn't the end of my family. It wasn't a rebellion. It was the start of learning to love them and myself with honesty. There's a quiet power in stepping away, not to punish, not to prove a point, but to find your own voice. There's courage in choosing a life that doesn't revolve around pleasing others. There's healing in realizing that your story can start wherever you decide to begin. The journey isn't linear. I still have days where the guilt creeps in, where I hear echoes of my father's voice saying, "We expected you home tonight," or my mother's soft sigh as she packed away the family photo albums without me in them. Some nights I stare at the ceiling and wonder if I've done the right thing. Some mornings I sip my coffee and feel the old ache in my chest. Some holidays I miss the weight of familiarity even when I know it came with invisible chains. But each time those thoughts rise, I return to the life I've built here. The canvases covered in watercolor sunsets and blooming gardens. The small kitchen table where I've shared countless meals with friends who see me not as someone's daughter, not as a placeholder, but as me. The patients at the hospital who've trusted me to walk with them through their most vulnerable moments, and who remind me that connection is still possible even after brokenness. When I first left, I thought I had to choose between family and freedom. I thought I had to burn bridges to stand on solid ground. But the truth is, real healing happens in the spaces where we allow both things to exist, the love and the limits, the connection and the boundaries. It hasn't been easy to rebuild my relationship with my parents. There are still things we tiptoe around, memories we carefully avoid. But something inside all of us shifted when I stopped pretending, when I stopped sacrificing myself to keep the peace. Our conversations now feel more like an exchange, not a performance. My dad still sends me Red Sox scores, still awkwardly asks about my art, but he's learning. My mom sends me small packages sometimes with paintbrushes, sometimes with handwritten notes that simply say, "Thinking of you." Michael, my brother, calls more now than he ever did when we were younger. We talk about work, about life, about the strange process of reintroducing ourselves to each other as adults. He tells me often that he's proud of me, that he's glad I finally chose myself. And you know what I am too? I'm proud of the woman who decided to leave quietly, without rage, without slamming doors, just with the calm certainty that she deserved a life built on her own terms. I'm proud of the woman who sat in watercolor classes with trembling hands and still picked up the brush. I'm proud of the woman who risked disappointing everyone she loved to finally become someone she could love. Maybe you see yourself in pieces of my story. Maybe you're still living in a house that feels too small for the person you're becoming. Maybe you've spent years performing, sacrificing, waiting for a seat at a table where you've always felt like a guest. If that's you, I want you to hear me clearly. You don't have to keep auditioning for love you already deserve. You don't have to stay in places that no longer see you. You don't have to carry the weight of someone else's dreams while silencing your own. It's okay to step back. It's okay to build something new. It's okay to say, "I love you, but I need space to love myself too." It's not selfish. It's not betrayal. It's survival. And it's growth. Your story matters. Your healing matters. And your freedom is worth fighting for even when it terrifies you. If you've ever stood at the edge of that decision, whether to stay, whether to go, whether to choose yourself, I want you to know you're not alone. There's a community here for you. There's a space where your story can be heard without judgment. I would love to hear your story in the comments. I would love to know how you've navigated your own turning points, your own painful realizations, your own breakthroughs. Please, if this resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe. There are more stories of healing, growth, and transformation to come, stories that remind us we are never as alone as we think. And always remember this: sometimes the most painful endings are the ones that lead to the most necessary beginnings. Thank you for witnessing my journey. Thank you for giving me space to share it with you. And thank you for finding the courage to write your own.